The war was over. David Carter should have been relieved, should have felt the weight of years of conflict lifting from his shoulders, the kind of victorious catharsis that Holovids always promise soldiers at the end of a long battle. Instead, he stood in the grand, over-decorated hall of a Zaran stronghold, feeling like someone had just handed him a live grenade and called it a gift. Because that's exactly what they had done. A gift. Or rather, she was. The woman standing before him was unmistakably Zaran, but unlike the towering reptilian warlords or the multi-eyed bureaucrats he had faced during the war, she was eerily human-like. Long limbs, pale silvery skin, golden eyes sharp with something between defiance and fear, and her ears, long, tapering to delicate points that twitched slightly when the warlord next to her spoke. "This is Nyx," the Zaran leader announced in a tone that suggested he was offering David a particularly fine bottle of wine rather than a living, breathing person. "A gift in honor of the peace between our species, a show of goodwill." David stared at the man, then at Nyx, then back at the man. "You can't be serious." The warlord's expression remained impassive. "You are a decorated warrior. In our culture, warriors are rewarded for their conquests." David exhaled through his nose. "Okay, first of all, I didn't conquer anything. Second," he gestured vaguely at Nyx, who remained utterly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "This isn't a gift. It's a hostage situation with extra steps." The warlord's ridged brow furrowed. "You refuse?" David opened his mouth to say yes, absolutely yes, but something in the warlord's gaze stopped him. A flicker of something sharp, expectant. If he refused, would it be an insult? Would it unravel whatever thin piece had been stitched together after years of bloodshed? He glanced at Nyx. She was watching him with unblinking intensity, her expression unreadable, but her shoulders were rigid, like someone bracing for impact. David swore under his breath. He looked back at the warlord and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fine, I accept." The warlord nodded approvingly. "May she bring you honor." David had a strong feeling that she was going to bring him nothing but headaches. The transport ride back to his ship was, without exaggeration, one of the most awkward experiences of David's life. Nyx sat across from him, her spine straight as a steel rod, hands folded in her lap. She had not spoken a word since they left the stronghold. She hadn't even blinked. David wasn't entirely sure she could blink. Finally, he cleared his throat. "So, Nyx, was it?" A slow nod. "Right. Listen, I just want to be clear on something." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You're not a prisoner. I don't own you. This whole situation is insane, and I'd rather not be part of it, but here we are. I'll figure out a way to get you somewhere safe, all right?" Nyx continued to stare at him. David sighed. "I swear I'm not gonna hurt you." She tilted her head ever so slightly, her golden eyes narrowing in silent calculation. Then at last she spoke, her voice soft but edged with something wary. "You are lying." David blinked. "Excuse me. I know what you are," she continued, her tone eerily calm. "I know why you accepted me as a gift." David ran a hand down his face. "Okay, I have a feeling this is going to be a real interesting interpretation of events. Go ahead. Enlighten me." Nyx inhaled deeply, as if gathering resolve. Then she whispered, "You intend to eat me." David choked on his own spit. "What?" Nyx didn't flinch. "It is the only explanation that makes sense." David held up a hand. Whoa, let's back this crazy train up for a second. You think I took you because I planned to eat you?" She gave him a look that suggested she thought he was being deliberately obtuse. "You are a predator." David opened his mouth, then closed it. Technically, that was not wrong. Humans were apex predators. Omnivorous, adaptable, efficient. "But that is not how things work," he said, rubbing his temples. "I'm not some kind of space cannibal." Nyx did not look convinced. "You say that now, but I have heard the stories, the way humans consume lesser creatures. You are simply waiting until I am properly fattened." David let out a strangled laugh. "Lady, if I wanted to fatten you up, I'd be offering you fries and a milkshake, not a ride-off world." Nyx's ears twitched slightly, as though considering this. "Then you will not feed me?" No, I will feed you, but not because. Ugh. He threw up his hands. This is ridiculous. Nix watched him with a quiet, unnerving intensity. So you say. David groaned and leaned back against the transport wall. This was going to be a long trip. By the time they reached his ship, the Wayfarer, David had a headache forming behind his eyes. Nix followed him silently up the ramp, her movements fluid and unnervingly quiet. She barely made a sound as she stepped into the ship's interior, her gaze flicking around like a wary animal assessing a new cage. David sighed. All right, here's the deal. I've got a spare room. You can stay there. Food's in the galley. Just try not to murder me in my sleep, yeah? Nix's lips parted slightly, as if he had just said something truly bizarre. You believe I would harm you? He raised an eyebrow. You literally think I'm planning to eat you. You don't see how that might make me nervous. She hesitated. Fair. David pinched the bridge of his nose. Look, let's just, get some food, okay? Maybe if you see me eating a perfectly normal, not Zarin person meal, you'll calm down. Nix gave him a long, unreadable stare. Then without a word, she turned and strode toward the galley, her posture stiff. David followed, muttering to himself about the absurdity of his life. As he pulled out rations, he felt her watching him closely. He tossed a protein bar onto the table. Here, not the best, but it won't kill you. Nix eyed the package, then him. Is this the first step? David frowned. First step of what? She held up the protein bar. The fattening. David groaned and dropped his head onto the table. This was going to be so much worse than he thought. The Wayfarer hummed softly as it drifted through the vast black of space, its engines settling into the low, steady rhythm of cruise mode. David Carter leaned against the galley counter, sipping a cup of coffee that tasted vaguely like burned plastic. He stared across the small room at Nix, who was perched on the edge of a chair, as if it might collapse beneath her at any moment. She had not touched the protein bar. Instead, she simply studied it, turning it over in her hands like it might suddenly sprout fangs and attack her. David exhaled. You know, if you're going to keep looking at it like that, I might start thinking you plan to eat it. Nix's golden eyes flicked up to meet his. It is unnatural. It's a protein bar, not a crime against nature. She set it down carefully, as though it were some sacred relic. It does not resemble food, David snorted. Yeah, welcome to human rations. The taste matches the appearance. Nix tilted her head, considering. Then why consume it? David shrugged. Convenient. Keeps me alive. Technically, food. He took another sip of his coffee and grimaced. Same reason I drink this sludge. Nix's gaze dropped to the steaming mug in his hands. That liquid smells like industrial solvent. David raised an eyebrow. That's how you know it's working. Nix blinked at him, clearly uncertain whether or not he was joking. He sighed and set his cup down. All right, let's start over. You gotta eat something. I have other options. Stuff that actually looks like food. I can even try to make a proper meal. You just have to tell me what you normally eat. Nix hesitated, then said carefully, the same things you eat. David frowned. If that was true, you wouldn't be looking at my protein bar like it's a ticking time bomb. Nix pursed her lips, clearly debating how much to say. Then after a long pause, she admitted, we eat meat. David nodded. Okay, so do we. But, she added quickly, we do not eat our equals. David sighed. Neither do we. This is going to be a running theme with you, huh? Nix merely folded her hands in her lap, gaze unreadable. David rubbed the back of his neck. I'm not feeding you anything weird. You can watch me eat first if it makes you feel better. Nix frowned slightly, her pointed ears twitching. I suppose that would be wise. David rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he rummaged through the storage compartments and pulled out something slightly better than a ration bar. A vacuum-sealed packet of pre-cooked chicken and a few hydroponic vegetables. He set about heating it up while Nix observed from a careful distance. As the scent filled the galley, Nix's expression shifted subtly. She wasn't exactly relaxed, but there was a flicker of curiosity there. Smells better than the protein bar, doesn't it? David said over his shoulder. Nix inclined her head slightly. It is less Offensive, David chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. When the food was ready, he sat across from her, taking an exaggeratedly slow bite of the chicken. See? Totally normal. No secret human seasoning that makes it taste like victory. Nix narrowed her eyes. I have heard humans marinate their meats in the blood of their enemies. David choked. What? Nix did not blink. Is it untrue? Yes, it's untrue. Where are you getting this from? Did the Zarin have a Human Horror Stories 101 class or something? Nix looked unconvinced but seemed to relax slightly. She hesitated before reaching forward, plucking a small piece of chicken from her plate. She sniffed it, then took a careful bite. Her ears twitched. David grinned. See? Not bad, right? Nix chewed slowly, then nodded once. Acceptable. David raised his coffee mug in mock celebration. Progress. Later after dinner, David gave Nix a brief tour of the ship, partly to make her more comfortable, partly to make sure she wouldn't start yanking on important wires in a misguided escape attempt. This is the bridge, he said, gesturing to the control panels and pilot seat. I do most of the flying manually, but the AI helps with long trips. Nix frowned at the blinking lights. Your ship has a mind? Sort of. It's not alive if that's what you're thinking. He tapped a button on the console. Wayfarer, say hi. The ship's smooth, gender-neutral voice replied, Hello, Nix. Nix took a cautious step back. It speaks, David smirked. Yeah, and if you insult it, it'll turn off the climate controls and make the ship very uncomfortable. I would not do that, the AI corrected. Nix studied the interface warily. I do not trust it, David shrugged. That makes two of us. He led her to the engine room next, where she eyed the machinery with a mixture of suspicion and intrigue. It is strange, she murmured, brushing her fingers over a pipe. What is? Nix glanced at him. You built all of this. You control it. And yet you do not rule your kind. David frowned. Why would I? In my world, those with power rule. The strongest, the most intelligent, the most cunning. But you have all this, she gestured at the ship. And yet you serve under others. David leaned against the wall. Well, first off, I don't serve anyone anymore. War's over, remember? I work for myself now. Nix seemed to consider this. And yet you do not claim more. David chuckled. I'm not looking to be a king, Nix. I just want to make enough to keep my ship flying and my head on my shoulders. Nix studied him, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning. That is a very unpredator-like answer. David grinned. Yeah? Well, maybe I'm an evolved predator. Nix gave him a long look, then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, muttered, Or maybe you are simply a fool. David snorted. That's the most accurate thing you've said all day. Nix did not smile, but for the first time she didn't look quite so rigid. On that night, David lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Nix was still wary of him, still half convinced he was plotting to toss her into an oven at the first opportunity. But at least she was talking, eating, engaging. And yet, as he listened to the faint hum of the ship around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this uneasy peace wouldn't last. Nix was smart, strong. He'd seen it in her posture, in the way she measured every word. She was no meek prisoner waiting to be rescued. She was a survivor, and survivors were always waiting for the next threat to come. David sighed. Let's just hope that threat isn't me. The Wayfarer drifted through the abyss, its hull gleaming under the pale light of distant stars. Inside, David Carter found himself faced with a new and unexpected challenge, cohabiting with someone who was convinced he would eventually consume her. It made for interesting mornings. David had barely taken 2 steps into the galley when he saw Nix already seated at the table, watching him with the silent intensity of a predator or a particularly judgmental roommate. He exhaled. Morning. Nix's golden eyes flickered over him, then to the steaming mug in his hand. The solvent drink again? David raised his coffee in salute. One day I'm going to make you try it. Nix's ears twitched, her expression unreadable. You will have to catch me first, David grinned. That sounds like a challenge. Nix merely took a slow bite of the fruit he had given her the night before. It wasn't quite the meat-heavy diet she was used to, but it seemed to be a safe compromise. He was still working on getting her to trust actual cooked meals. "So," David said, pulling out a chair, "what's on the schedule today? Staring at me suspiciously? Accusing me of elaborate culinary conspiracies?" Nix considered this, chewing thoughtfully. "Perhaps." David chuckled, shaking his head. "At least you're honest." After breakfast, David brought Nix to the cargo bay, figuring she might want to do something other than watch him exist. "All right," he said, tapping on a crate. "I've got some spare parts in here. Stuff I use for repairs. Ever fix a ship before?" Nix crossed her arms. "I have dismantled many ships." David smirked. "Yeah, see, that's kind of the opposite of what I need." Nix studied the scattered tools and equipment. "I learn quickly." "Good, because I'll need an extra pair of hands next time something blows up." Nix raised a brow. "Does your ship often explode?" David hesitated. Define often. Nix did not look reassured. Regardless, she seemed intrigued as he showed her some of the simpler tasks, replacing worn-out power couplings, recalibrating the ship's internal sensors. She watched his hands carefully, absorbing every movement with sharp, analytical focus. At one point, she reached out and adjusted one of the tools he was holding. "You are doing it incorrectly." David blinked. "Oh? And you suddenly know the correct way?" Nix gave him a look. "Your technique is inefficient." David opened his mouth to argue, then glanced at the adjustment she had made. It was actually better. "Huh," he grinned. "Guess I have a new mechanic." Nix's ears twitched, but she said nothing. She did, however, keep working. A few hours later, David sat on the bridge, stretching his arms behind his head. Nix stood near the viewport, staring out at the endless black. "So," David said, watching her, "what's your plan?" Nix turned slightly. "Plan? For what comes next? You don't really think I'm going to keep you locked up forever, right?" She hesitated. David sighed. "Look, I meant what I said. I'm not keeping you. You're not a prisoner. I just need to figure out where you'd be safe." Nix's gaze flickered. "Safe is a fragile thing." David frowned. "Yeah, well, it's better than the alternative." Nix studied him for a long moment. Then softly she asked, "Why do you care?" David blinked. "What?" Nix took a step closer, her golden eyes searching his. "Why do you insist on helping me?" David exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Because it's the right thing to do." Nix's ears twitched. "That is not a sufficient reason." David chuckled dryly. "Well, sorry, but that's all I've got." Nix didn't reply, but something in her posture shifted, ever so slightly. Later that night, as David was checking the ship's status reports, he heard a soft noise behind him. He turned to find Nix standing in the doorway. She hesitated. Then in a quieter voice than usual, she said, "Good night." David raised a brow. "Did you just... Wait, was that a normal, non-hostile good night?" Nix narrowed her eyes. "Do not make me regret it." David grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it." Nix huffed and disappeared down the hall. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally getting somewhere. The Wayfarer glided smoothly through the void, the soft hum of its engines the only sound filling the corridors. David Carter sat in the cockpit, boots propped up on the console, nursing what had to be his fourth cup of coffee that day. He was staring blankly at the star map, letting his thoughts drift, when Nix appeared in the doorway, her golden eyes sharp as ever. David didn't even look at her as he spoke. "If you're here to stare at me like an assassin contemplating my untimely demise, you'll have to take a number." Nix tilted her head. "You assume I require a number?" David finally turned, smirking. "Fair point. You'd probably just bypass the whole system and take me out when I least expect it." Nix folded her arms, her long ears twitching. "Your confidence in my skills is noted." David stretched, cracking his neck. "What's up?" Nix hesitated, then stepped further inside. "You said I am free." "Yup. And yet I remain." David nodded. "Also true?" Nix frowned slightly as though she expected some hidden meaning. I do not understand why. David sighed, setting his cup down. Well, for one, you don't have anywhere to go. Not exactly a lot of friendly ports willing to take in a former enemy of humanity. Nix exhaled slowly, glancing at the viewport. My people would not take me back. David hesitated. Because of what happened. Nix's fingers flexed against her arms. Because I was given away. They do not take back what was discarded. David frowned, his stomach twisting slightly at the coldness in her words. He wasn't sure why he kept getting surprised by how different their cultures were. Every time he thought he understood, something like this came up and reminded him that Nix hadn't just been raised with different customs, she had been raised with entirely different truths. So that settles it, David said, forcing his tone to be lighter. You're stuck with me. Nix gave him a long look. A fate worse than death. David pressed a hand to his chest. Ouch! Right to the heart. Nix's lips twitched. So briefly, David almost missed it. He grinned. Was that a smile? Did I just witness the rare and elusive Nix showing amusement? Nix immediately schooled her expression into neutrality. You are mistaken. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Oh no, I saw it. You can't take it back now. Nix rolled her eyes. You are impossible. David spread his arms. And yet, here you are, choosing to stay. Nix said nothing, but she didn't deny it. Later, while David was checking over the ship's inventory, he heard a loud clatter from the galley. He rushed in, expecting some kind of disaster, only to find Nix standing stiffly next to the counter, staring down at a cup she had apparently dropped. David arched a brow. What happened? Nix's ears twitched. The ship shifted. David crossed his arms. Nix, we're in a deep space. Nothing shifted. Nix was silent for a long moment. Then finally she muttered, I was startled. David's smirk softened. By what? Nix glared at the cup like it had personally insulted her. The food preparation machine made a noise. David blinked. You mean the coffee maker? Nix gestured toward it. It hissed at me. David tried not to laugh. He really did. But the mental image of the fierce, deadly Nix being intimidated by a coffee maker was too much. Nix narrowed her eyes. Do not mock me. David held up his hands, struggling to keep a straight face. No, I would never. Nix glared at him for a moment longer before exhaling sharply and kneeling to pick up the cup. David knelt as well, helping her. Look, if you're curious about something, just ask. You don't have to skulk around like a spy on a secret mission. Nix huffed. I do not skulk. David grinned. I don't know. That sounds like something a skulker would say. Nix gave him a look that promised retribution. David merely handed her the cup. Come on, I'll show you how the coffee maker works. Nix eyed it warily. Will it hiss at me again? David smirked. Only if you insult its honor. Nix's ears twitched, but this time, she didn't look quite so wary. That night, David lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the ship. Nix was still an enigma. She was learning to live aboard the Wayfarer, but she hadn't quite let go of her instincts. She still expected betrayal, still prepared for danger. But for the first time, he thought, maybe she was beginning to trust him. Just a little. David had exactly 3 seconds of peace that morning before the chaos started. He was in the galley mid-sip of his first coffee when a loud metallic thunk echoed through the ship. He froze. A second thunk followed, accompanied by a frustrated growl. With a resigned sigh, David set his cup down and made his way to the cargo bay, already suspecting the source of the disturbance. Sure enough, he found Nix crouched over a disassembled panel, tools scattered around her in a precise but chaotic arrangement. A small power conduit sparked angrily beside her, and judging by the smudge of grease on her cheek, she had been at this for a while. David leaned against the doorway. So, do I even want to know what you're doing? Nix didn't look up. The ventilation system is inefficient. David arched a brow. That's a fancy way of saying you took apart my ship's cooling system without asking. Nix finally glanced at him, her golden eyes sharp. It was suboptimal. David exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. You do realize that suboptimal is still functional, right? Nix turned back to her work. It is now more functional. David crouched beside her, peering at the exposed wiring. Please tell me you didn't mess with the ship's core systems. Nix scoffed. I am not reckless. David gave her a flat look. This coming from the person who dismantled an entire engine cooling duct because it annoyed her. Nix's ears twitched, but she didn't argue. David sighed, grabbing a nearby rag to wipe off some of the grime. All right, let's test it. If you broke something, I'm officially revoking your self-appointed mechanic privileges. Nix huffed. You lack authority to revoke what I never requested. David chuckled. You sound way too proud of that. Still, when he flipped the system back online, he had to admit, Nix's adjustments had actually improved efficiency. The airflow was smoother, and the temperature equalization across the ship balanced out almost instantly. David crossed his arms, nodding. Okay, not bad. Nix glanced at him, ears flicking. I told you so, David pointed at her. Yeah, but if I agree with you, you're going to get insufferable. Nix smirked. Then I look forward to more opportunities. David groaned. I have created a monster. Later, while David was recalibrating the ship's starboard sensors, Nix sat nearby, watching him work. She had been watching him a lot more lately, not in the wary, suspicious way she used to, but with something closer to curiosity. David glanced at her. All right, what's on your mind? Nix tilted her head. Why do humans name their ships? David blinked, then shrugged. I don't know. Tradition, I guess. Makes it feel less like just a hunk of metal. Nix considered this. Zarin ships do not have names. David smirked. Yeah, that tracks. You guys strike me as the impersonal designation code type. Nix nodded. Our vessels are assigned numbers. Practical, efficient. David arched a brow. Boring, Nix huffed. It is logical. David leaned back, gesturing around them. Yeah, but calling my ship Designation 325B doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Nix hesitated, then looked around. Wayfarer, she said slowly. David smiled. Yup, it's been through a lot with me. Nix was quiet for a moment before she asked, Did you name it? David shook his head. Nah, had the name when I got it, but I liked it, so I kept it. Nix seemed to roll that thought around in her head. Then with surprising softness, she said, It suits you. David blinked, caught off guard. Then he grinned. Look at you, throwing around compliments. If I didn't know better, I'd think you actually liked me. Nix's ears twitched. Do not get ahead of yourself. David chuckled, turning back to his work. Too late. That night, as David sat in the cockpit, staring out at the vast emptiness of space, Nix joined him without a word. She stood by the viewport, her golden eyes reflecting the distant starlight. After a long silence, she finally said, You do not fear the dark. David glanced at her. Should I? Nix considered that, then shook her head. No. David leaned back. You do, though. Nix didn't answer immediately. Then so quietly he almost didn't hear, she said, I fear what lurks within it. David exhaled. Yeah, I get that. Nix glanced at him, studying him carefully. Do you? David smiled, but there was something tired in it. More than you think. Nix hesitated. Then in an act that surprised even herself, she sat down beside him. She didn't say anything else. But for the first time since they met, she allowed the silence between them to be comfortable. David had just finished rerouting a stubborn power circuit when the ship's alarm blared to life, cutting through the usual quiet hum of the Wayfarer like a blade. He nearly smacked his head on the console as he jolted up. Nix, he called, already moving toward the cockpit. I did nothing, Nix's voice replied over the comms. Yet, David groaned. That's not comforting. When he reached the controls, Nix was already seated in the co-pilot's chair, her golden eyes scanning the readouts with practiced efficiency. David slid into his seat, fingers dancing over the console. What are we looking at? Nix's ears flicked. Proximity alert. Unidentified vessel on an intercept course. David frowned. Pirates? Nix shook her head. Not a standard pirate signature. Their approach is deliberate, not aggressive. But they are blocking our trajectory. David exhaled. Great. Love that. He reached for the comms. Unidentified vessel. This is the Wayfarer. State your business before I get twitchy. There was a long pause. Then, finally, a crackling voice came through. Lieutenant David Carter, we have business with you. David stiffened. He didn't recognize the voice, but the fact that they knew his name, never a good sign. Nix glanced at him. Friends of your? David sighed. Probably the opposite. Nix hummed. Then I assume we are not inviting them aboard for tea. David smirked. That depends. Do we have poison tea? Nix arched a brow. I could make some. David chuckled, then flicked the comms back on. Yeah, I don't do business with vague threats. You want to talk, you tell me who you are and what you want. A pause, then. You have something that belongs to us. David groaned. That's even vaguer. Nix, meanwhile, was still reading the scans. Then quietly she murmured, Zarin. David tensed. You sure? Nix nodded. Their vessel is modified, but the signature is Zarin Tech. David looked back at the comms. If this is about Nix, you're out of luck. She's not property. Silence, then. You are mistaken. We are not here for her. That caught both of them off guard. Nix's ears twitched, and David shot her a look before keying the comms again. All right, you have my attention. What exactly do you think I have? Your ship. David blinked. Excuse me? Nix glanced around the cockpit. They want the Wayfarer? David scoffed. Well, they can't have her. The voice on the other end remained steady. You are in possession of classified Zarin technology embedded within your vessel. You will surrender it to us. David blinked again, then leaned toward Nix. Did you, install something extra when you were messing around in the ship's systems? Nix glared. I did not. David tapped his fingers against the console, thinking. All right, Mystery Zarin dude, I don't know what you think is on my ship, but unless it's a stash of contraband I forgot about, you're going to have to be more specific. Then we will take the vessel by force. David sighed. And there it is, the inevitable threat. Nix's fingers hovered over the weapons console. Do we fight? David hesitated. The Wayfarer wasn't a battleship. It had defenses, but going up against a fully equipped Zarin vessel? Not a great plan. Instead, he grinned. Nope. We run. Nix narrowed her eyes. Cowardice? David smirked. Strategy. With a flick of a switch, he punched the engines to full burn, sending the Wayfarer into a sharp dive. The enemy ship reacted instantly, pursuing them with rapid acceleration. Nix, keep them off our tail, David ordered. I'm gonna see if I can lose them in the asteroid belt ahead. Nix's eyes flashed with challenge. I will try not to destroy them too quickly, David chuckled. That's the spirit. As he wove the ship through the scattered debris of a nearby asteroid field, Nix fired off precise shots, forcing the enemy ship to adjust its trajectory. David grinned. You sure you weren't a pilot in a past life? Nix smirked. I was an infiltrator, but we were trained in many skills. David swerved hard to avoid a spiraling chunk of rock. Remind me to never play chess with you. Nix arched a brow. I would win. Exactly. The enemy ship fired a barrage of energy blasts, one of which grazed their aft shields. Shields at 60%, Nix reported. David cursed under his breath. All right, plan B. Nix gave him a wary glance. There was a plan A? David grinned. Not really. He suddenly cut the engines, letting the Wayfarer drift. The enemy ship shot past them, overshooting their trajectory. Nix's eyes widened. That was reckless, David smirked, but effective. He reignited the thrusters, veering in the opposite direction, putting as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. After a few tense minutes, Nix checked the scanners. They are not following, David exhaled. Guess they weren't expecting me to pull a crazy stunt. Nix studied him. You are difficult to predict. David chuckled. That's half the fun. Nix shook her head, but there was the faintest hint of amusement in her gaze. David relaxed slightly, but a nagging thought remained. Why did the Zarin think his ship had something of theirs? And more importantly, what if they weren't wrong? The Wayfarer drifted through deep space, the hum of the engine steady, the stars outside stretching endlessly in all directions. David leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, staring at the controls as if waiting for them to throw another crisis at him. It had been a few hours since their escape from the Zarin ship, but he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was still lurking just over the horizon. Nix sat across from him, sharpening a knife she absolutely did not need to sharpen. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filled the silence between them. She wasn't looking at him, but David could tell she was thinking about the same thing he was. Finally, she spoke. "You are restless." David exhaled through his nose. "You ever get the feeling something's not over?" Nix paused, considering his words. "There is always another battle, but this one..." She tapped the blade against the arm of her chair. "I do not think they will return." David wasn't so sure. "They wanted something from the ship, and they wouldn't just chase us for fun." Nix gave him a flat look. "You are irritating enough to warrant a chase." David smirked. "Ah, you do like me." Nix flicked a small metal bolt at his forehead. He caught it easily, grinning. "All right," he said, tossing the bolt aside. "Let's figure this out before another band of angry Zarin decides to show up." Nix stood, moving to the main console. "The ship's logs might hold an answer." David nodded. "I'll start digging." For the next hour, they sifted through files, old records, engine diagnostics, anything that might hint at what the Zarin were after. David was halfway through an outdated cargo manifest when he spotted something strange. "Huh?" Nix's ears twitched. "Huh?" David leaned in closer. "There's an encrypted file in here. Looks like it was buried deep in the system, way before I even owned this ship." Nix moved beside him, scanning the screen. "Zarin encryption." David exhaled sharply. "Great, love that." Nix's fingers danced over the console. "I can break it," David smirked. "Of course you can." It took a few minutes, but soon the file unlocked with a soft chime. What appeared on the screen was unexpected. Blueprints, detailed schematics of a Zarin stealth drive. David sat back, rubbing his jaw. "Well, that explains a lot." Nix studied the datum. "This technology is highly classified. No human should possess it." David let out a low whistle. "So the real question is, how did it end up on my ship?" Nix's expression was unreadable. "Whoever owned this vessel before you must have stolen it." David grimaced. "Which means I just inherited their mess." Nix tilted her head. "Are you surprised?" David sighed. "Not even a little." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Nix spoke. "What will you do with it?" David thought for a long moment, then smirked. "I think I'll get rid of it." Nix's ears flicked. "You would discard technology that could give you an advantage?" David shrugged. "I'd rather not have an entire empire chasing me across the galaxy." He tapped the console. "Besides, I like to win my fights honestly." Nix studied him carefully. Then after a pause, she nodded. "You are strange," David grinned. "You're just figuring that out now?" Nix's expression softened just a little. "Number, but it is clearer than before." With a few keystrokes, David wiped the file from the system, making sure there was no trace left. Then he leaned back, stretching. "All right, that should put an end to our little mystery." Nix exhaled, watching as the screen flickered back to normal. "So it is done," David nodded. "Looks like it." For the first time in what felt like forever, the ship was quiet. No alarms, no threats looming over them. Just the soft hum of the Wayfarer as it glided through the stars. After a while, Nix spoke again. "When we first met, I thought you would kill me." David looked over at her, brow raised. "Wow, that's what we're reminiscing about?" Nix's golden eyes locked onto his. "You were kind, and that confused me." David held her gaze. "Still does, huh?" Nix hesitated. Then quietly she said, "Less than before." David grinned. "I'll take it." For once, Nix didn't roll her eyes. She just sat there, watching the stars with him. After a while, David stretched and stood. "All right, I say we celebrate surviving yet another near-death experience." Nix arched a brow. "With what?" David smirked. "I've got some rations left, and..." He paused dramatically. One last packet of real coffee. Nix tilted her head. This is your version of a feast? David placed a hand over his heart. Listen, some of us find joy in the simple things. Nix's lips twitched. Then let us feast, human. David chuckled. See? You are learning. As they walked toward the galley, something settled between them. Not spoken, not forced. Just an understanding. Nix was no longer a prisoner. David was no longer just her captor. And maybe, just maybe, the universe wasn't as cold as it seemed.